So in the last video when we left off, I asked how we could increase this signal without the risk of clipping. We wanted to increase the resonant section of this signal without clipping. So this highlighted area indicates the peak, the highest peak of where the stick would contact the skin. And you can see it's almost at 0 or close to. This area here is where the drum resonates. That's the sound. That's the part of the signal that contains the sound of the drum. So we want to increase that without clipping the signal, without getting these peaks here to come up. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what each of these sections sound like. This section here, the resonant part of the signal, I'm going to loop it about 5 times. And then I'm going to compare it to the peak. You can hear the difference of what the stick contacting the snare sounds like versus when it rings out a little bit. So have a listen to these, and I'll highlight the areas that are playing so you can get a reference. Now, if I was to increase the volume here, the entire signal is going to come up. You can see the peaks came up almost at 0. We're risking some distortion and clipping. What we want to do is increase the tail section, the decay part, without bringing up the peak. And the way we do that, or the way I do it, the way I was shown, is using a compressor. I'm going to show you what all these buttons on the compressor does so that when you apply it to your recording, you understand what buttons you're tweaking and what they're actually doing, because like I said before, all of our software, our microphones, our drum sets are different. So learning how to set the compressor as opposed to giving you certain settings is going to work out better for you in the end. Okay, so if we're looking at this snare signal, you can see that most of the average signal is happening at around -18. If we were to draw a line through this section here, most of the peaks would be happening at around 18. These peaks are going almost to 0. So if we even increase this signal by about 1 decibel, it's going to hit 0. We need to get this up much higher, more than 1 decibel. Let's say 5 to 10 decibels. That's going to push this past 0 and start clipping. So using the compressor here, the threshold, I'm going to start the threshold at -20 decibels, which is approximately right about here. Okay, what that means is when this signal goes from infinity and starts to cross over -20, that's when the compressor is going to activate, or at least want to start doing something. So anything above -20 is going to be affected. Anything below -20, like these signals, these parts of the signal here, they're not getting affected because they're quieter. All right, most people, or not most people, some people think the compressor is going to squish everything, but that's not true. I mean, you can do that depending on how you set it, but the point of this is you want to get as much average power as possible. So squishing the signal down is only going to make it quieter. So in this case, the way we're going to set it, I'll show you what it sounds like. So starting at -20, and about here is when the compressor is going to turn on. Okay. The ratio determines how much of the signal above -20 is going to be reduced. So the ratio, it's not measured in decibels, it's a ratio because it's going to affect or reduce the gain by a certain amount. So let's say the signal, this one here, is going to -1.2. If we say the ratio is 2 to 1, that means it's going to cut this these peaks in half. Not 2 decibels, but in half. It's the ratio. So every 2 decibels that go over, 1 decibel is going to be reduced, if that makes sense. The makeup gain here is to replenish any of the signal that we reduce from the compressor. Like I said before, we want to keep the signal strong. We don't want to reduce it. Compressing something and making it quieter is not going to make for a very strong mix. So if the peak was going up to 1.2 before, and we're cutting it down, let's say it's going to go to, I don't know, -8, then we want to increase the gain by 4 decibels to bring it, let's say, up to 4.1. If we want to go up to 1 again, we can increase the makeup gain to 6. So now the peak is still at 1.2, but we're sort of limiting this volume here. This section is going to increase in volume, but this won't go over 1.2, or not by very much. Okay, so I'm going to play around with the ratio. You can hear how, the more you squish it, the weirder it sounds. It's very produced, but at least you get an idea of what you're doing by setting the ratio. So the makeup gain replenishes the gain we lose by cutting the peak. The threshold determines when it starts to compress. The attack is measured in milliseconds. So let me see. This here is approximately from this start point when the stick makes contact to about here. It's approximately 50 milliseconds. Now, if we set the attack to 50 milliseconds, then any part of this signal, when it crosses -20, the compressor is going to wait 50 milliseconds. It's going to go 50 milliseconds, and then it's going to start compressing. So we can actually let some of this stick noise through. If you like a little bit of this crack to your snare, then you can delay the attack. You can delay when the compressor starts compressing. If you want to immediately cut these peaks, you're going to reduce the attack time. So let's say 13 milliseconds, just arbitrarily. That's not, I'm not making any predictions here. I don't know how it's going to sound, but let's say we start almost immediately. When the signal goes up to -20, 13 milliseconds later, this peak still might get through, but these ones are going to get cut. We're not going to worry about the hold because most compressors won't have that setting. The release, this is a very important setting because the release time tells the compressor when to stop compressing after the signal drops below the threshold. So after these peaks come below -20, the compressor will continue to compress as long as this release time allows it to. So by setting a short release time, we can stop the compression after the signal comes below -20. Okay, so if you're playing a fast song, you're hitting a snare, I don't know how many times, let's say 120 beats per minute. If you have this release time set so long, let's say 700 milliseconds, then your next snare shot might happen here, and the compressor is going to continue compressing and totally disregard the attack time because you've crossed over, if that makes sense. So if the release time is set really short, 20 milliseconds, let's say, after it comes below minus 20 milliseconds later, let's say the compressor stops doing its job here, your next snare hit will start, let's say, here. Well, then all this cycle comes into effect again. Alright, so I'm going to loop some snare, and I'm going to adjust the ratio and the threshold mostly. These two are going to make the most difference. Okay, here's a little recording I did earlier. I'm going to use this to set our compressor. What we're going to do now is just going to solo the snare so we can hear what it sounds like. Okay, so now we're just hearing the close mic on the snare. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the threshold and the ratio. So right now everything's off. You can see there's no gain reduction because the threshold is at 0. It's allowing the signal to go right to the top. Okay, so I'm going to set the ratio, let's say, to 4:1. So that means every 4 decibels of signal going over the threshold, you're only getting 1 decibel out, 4:1. So it's a much more aggressive ratio compression than 2:1. So watch the lights here as I'm going to bring the threshold down to say minus 20. So there's a little bit of peak happening where the stick contacts the skin, and that's what we're cutting off right here. And we want to replenish that gain using the makeup gain. I already have 8 decibels. But you can see as I reduce the makeup gain, the signal gets quieter. Don't necessarily want that all the time. So you want to match the makeup gain with the original peak. We'll say it's reducing 5 decibels, so I'm just going to bring it up to about 6 decibels, and that should replenish most of the signal that we lost. And just going to reduce the threshold even more, give you a bigger effect here. You can see how quiet the signal gets. I'm going to increase the ratio, and now we're getting more of an average volume, and you're also hearing a lot of the ping off the snare. These are the signals that you couldn't hear before because they were buried below all that stick crack and stuff. And now we've reduced that peak and we're bringing up all the subtle signals. You can hear almost a reverb effect from the room, the resonance of the shell, and like I said, that peak. It sounds really dry, but we can tweak that with EQ later. I'm just going to increase the makeup gain, maybe 18 decibels, because we're reducing 18 decibels or so. And now you can just adjust as necessary using your peak meters on your mixer to get your original volume back.